Welcome to The Jewish Diasporist, a podcast exploring the political, social, and cultural implications of life in diaspora. We are two of your hosts, Zach Smerin
and Ben Yanowitz. For this episode, Zach spoke to Professor Avi Shlaim, a preeminent historian of the Middle East, who stands alongside Ilan Pappé and others as one of the key new historians of Israeli history. Shlaim has written prolifically over his long career, publishing many books, including The Iron Wall, Israel in the Arab World, and Collusion Across the Jordan, King Abdullah, the Zionist Movement, and the Partition of Palestine.
Most recently, Professor Shlaim wrote Three Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew, retelling his life story within the context of a broader history of the times and places he lived in. Born in Baghdad in 1945, Shlaim and his family, like over 100,000 other Jews who had called Iraq their home for 25 centuries, was forced to emigrate to Israel in 1950.
This conversation can roughly be split into two parts.
Firstly, I asked Professor Shlaim a few questions about the study of history and its role within understanding current events, which as an aspiring historian was a real pleasure and honor. In the second half, we talked in detail about the historic and current understandings of Arab-Jewish identity and how it can inspire us towards nurturing vibrant and diverse Jewishness in global and local contexts, serving as a bridge between competing nationalisms in the Middle East and beyond.
Unfortunately, this episode is on the shorter side, as we were limited by time constraints and thus unable to cover quite as much as we would have liked to. If you'd like to hear more from Avi Shlaim, you can find numerous interviews online and several in our show notes. Nevertheless, we hope this conversation will provide food for thought and can help ground future conversations like this one.
Thank you so much to our donors. If you like what we are doing here, please rate our show on your podcast platform of choice, subscribe to us on our YouTube channel, definitely do consider supporting us on Patreon, and share our content within your communities.
Without further ado, enjoy the discussion.
Professor Shlaim, thank you so much for joining us. It's really a great honor to have you on. Both me and Ben are students of history. And so the first question that I really thought would be worth asking is, you have spent a significant part of your career on the study of Israel-Palestine. What do you think the role of trying to establish that historical context is on understanding conflict, the situation in the Middle East is?
I believe that the role of history is absolutely crucial in understanding contemporary world affairs. Every conflict has a history, and without delving into the history of the conflict, we cannot make sense of what is happening today. I am an emeritus professor of international relations at Oxford, and so my academic discipline is international relations, which is a social science. But I began my university career as a history student at Cambridge. This is over 50 years ago. And once a historian, always a historian. So in my writing and teaching of international relations, I've always adopted a historical approach. When I was an undergraduate at Cambridge, my tutor, Harry Hinsley, who later became Professor Sir Harry Hinsley, told us that the best approach to international relations is history. One day, a better approach may be found, but until then, history is the best approach. And now, over 50 years on, I still think that the history is the best approach. Now, to turn to more specifically the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there is no way that we can understand this conflict unless we put it in its proper historical context. And as in any other conflict, there are conflicting narratives. There is a Palestinian narrative of this conflict, and there is an Israeli narrative of the conflict. What they have in common is both portray themselves as the victims. And my job as a historian is to look at conflicting narratives of this conflict and to go to the archives, to do the research, and then to report what I have found. That's how I approach the writing of history about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, an emphasis on archival research, the emphasis on multi-archival research. So in this case, I used Israeli records, British archives, American archives, and UN archives. Arab states don't have archives. They don't open the records on a systematic basis for our research, but that doesn't mean there aren't really important and valuable Arabic primary sources on this conflict. So there is a huge asymmetry in the resources available on the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. And some of my Israeli critics say you can't write definitively about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because the Arabic archives are not open. And my reply to them is a historian can only write on the basis that the sources that are available. We can't write on the basis of sources that are not available. And I say to myself the same advice that I give to my PhD students when they hit particularly difficult patch in their research and they can't find crucial evidence for their thesis. And I say to them, make the most of what you have. It's better to light a candle than to curse the darkness.
I think as well, the reason why I asked this question, of course, is it's connected to part of my own research, and I'll mention that in a second. I think there's, in the context of Israel-Palestine, of course, a lot of the history is very much not reserved strictly in academic fields. It's something that is a very popular subject, very popular type of history. And so I wonder sometimes when I do my own historical research, which is about post-war Jewish life in Poland, whether or not I'm either not trying to even subconsciously romanticize the period or try and establish some sort of alternative to what might have been. And that goes even, further to the interwar period. I'm someone who's very interested in the history of the Jewish left and the Bund and what could have been had X not happened. And I'm wondering, do you think that there is some kind of risk towards falling down a path of trying to find an alternative history of what could have been, or trying to come back to a period that no longer exists in order to, from a purely pragmatic perspective of what the situation is today, solving the problems of the world as they are?
I am probably not as imaginative as you are in thinking of counterfactuals and alternatives to what actually happened. I've lived in Britain most of my life, and I'm a British empiricist. And often these days when I'm interviewed about current affairs, about the war in Gaza, and what is likely to happen the day after the guns fall silent, I am always tempted to say that I'm a historian. I'm much more comfortable in dealing with the past than speculating about the future. But your point is not about speculating about the future, but looking at counterfactuals, what might have happened. And I think it's difficult enough to collect the material and to understand what happened and why, that I tend not to look at what might have happened. But inevitably, the question arises. Even if I don't consciously pose the question, it arises. I'll give you one example. Yitzhak Rabin signed the Oslo Accord with the PLO. This was a historic turning point because it was the first peace agreement between the two principal parties to the conflict, Israel and the Palestinians. So it was, for all its limitations, the Oslo Accord was a historic document. Then in 1995, 2 years later, Rabin was assassinated. The Likud came back to power under Benjamin Netanyahu, and proceeded to dismantle the Oslo Accords. So one has to ask what might have happened had Rabin not been assassinated by a Jewish fanatic. And there is no clear or definitive answer to that because history doesn't disclose its alternatives. And my speculation would be that the Oslo peace process wouldn't have broken down. Rabin was fixated on Israeli security. And in the first 2 years, there was very close security cooperation between the two sides. Rabin would have proceeded step by step towards a settlement of the conflict. So that's my one example of alternative history that I've thought about.
In terms of historical research, there's been a lot of use of the label of new historians in the context of Israel-Palestine. This is no longer really a new label. I mean, it comes from the 1980s. But do you think that this label of new historians that has been used to describe you, Benny Morris, Ilan Pappé, do you think that this label still has meaning in the understanding and research of historiography today?
The term, the new historiography, was coined by Benny Morris. And inevitably, it's simplistic. It's a label. Just as the old history is a label, it doesn't do justice to the complexity and variety of traditional Zionist versions of the past. So these are labels, but it's quite a useful label, new history. And the three pioneers were Benny Morris, Ilan Pappé, and myself. In 1988, we published our books, and Benny Morris's book was called The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, 1947 to 1949. Ilan Pappé's book was called Britain and the Arab-Israeli Conflict, 1948-1951. And my book was called Collusion Across the Jordan, King Abdullah, the Zionist Movement, and the Partition of Palestine. Incidentally, Ilan Pappé was a PhD student at the Middle East Center at St. Anthony's, where I am an emeritus fellow. And in 1984, he submitted his PhD thesis, and I was his external examiner.
Oh, I didn't know that.
All the ideas of the new history are in that thesis in one form or another. So he deserves much of the credit for this trend in historiography. What is common to all of us is that we are much more critical of the traditional Zionist version of the conflict. In fact, if you take these three books together, we, between us, mounted frontal attack on all the myths that have come to surround the birth of Israel and the first Arab-Israeli war. Benny Morris demonstrated that the Palestinians, refugees, did not leave of their own accord. They were pushed out. Ilan Pappé demonstrated that contrary to Zionist historiography, at the end of the British Mandate for Palestine, Britain's aim was not to abort the birth of a Jewish state, but to abort the birth of a Palestinian state. And in my book, Collusion Across the Jordan, I argued that the real lineup in 1948 was not Jews on one side and all the Arabs on the other side, that the real political lineup below the surface was the Hashemite ruler of Transjordan, King Abdullah, and the Jewish agency against the Palestinians and Arab nationalists. So I tried to show that this wasn't a straightforward bipolar affair, but that one Arab party, Jordan, was in cahoots with the Zionists. And that's an important revision of the Zionist rendition of events. The two factors were responsible for the emergence of the new history. One is the opening of the Israeli archives under the 30-year rule, which Israel copied from Britain and used to apply very liberally until Netanyahu changed all this. And it's very much to Israel's credit that it used to allow free access to its records that made possible critical studies such as those my colleagues and I published. And the other factor was the political climate in Israel following the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. This was a very controversial war. There was dissent during that war, and that led to questioning Israel's past wars as well. And the notion of en brera collapsed. The notion of en brera, there is no alternative, collapsed because Israel didn't have to invade Lebanon. Israel was not attacked. This was not a war of no choice. It was a war of choice. And the collapse of the notion of en brera opened up the space for debate, and we moved into this space. And we generated serious debate, not just in academia, but in the public in general. The Israeli public are very, very interested in their past and in this debate. And it was a sign of the maturity of Israeli society that the public engaged in this debate. And the new history did have an impact. It did lead to a change of some views. Some of the findings of the new history, especially Benny Morris's notion that Israel was responsible for the Palestinian refugee problem, some of these ideas infiltrated into the mainstream. But the political climate during the Oslo decade was on our side. There was more openness, more willingness to understand another point of view. But with the outbreak of the Second Intifada in 2000, Israel reverted to fundamentalist positions, to us and them, and there was much less sympathy for critical views such as ours. And today, the term new history wouldn't mean anything to the majority of Israelis, but it is a very important school of thought about Israel's past.
That examination of the immediate years around the founding of the State of Israel, it takes me well to what I wanted to also discuss in the remaining time that we have about Arab-Jewish identity. You recently wrote a memoir that was one of the inspirations behind wanting to reach out to you, Three Worlds, which talks about your birth and early years in Baghdad in Iraq, your move to Israel, and then finally to Britain. You mentioned in your interview, I listened to your interview on the Middle East Eye, that you identify as an Arab Jew, and you attribute that to the language you spoke, the culture, the relationships with Arabic neighbors. But you also said that Israelis with family history from the Arab world, but who grew up in Israel with only that, or that as their primary context, are not Arab Jews, at least not in the same sense of the word. And I was wondering a bit about this. We focus here on the Jewish diaspora, on specifically diaspora identities. And it reminded me of an article that was published in 972 Mag a few years ago by Hadar Cohen, which is Zionism has no space for an Arab Jew like me. And it concludes like this. Cohen has a family history from Palestine, from Syria, from Iraq. And it finishes with this conclusion: as someone who grew up in Israel, I choose to identify as an Arab Jew because it breaks down the walls around identity that Zionism has created. It shatters the colonial framework and creates a possibility for a different narrative. To me, this is essential in the evolution of the discourse. And so there's been a lot that's been attributed to the fact that Jews from Middle Eastern countries, or that came from families from the Middle East, today primarily vote and support the right in Israel. But do you think that it's worthwhile trying to use that label to describe Jews that came from Arabic countries, that have Arabic culture that is part of their identity, that may choose to strongly identify in that way in the present?
It seems to me that it's up to each individual to define their own identity. And I never thought about my identity until I started writing my memoirs. So I either reinvented myself or rediscovered myself as an Arab Jew. And there is no question at all that an Arab Jew is a good description of my initial identity, because I was born to a Jewish family in Baghdad, and we were Arab Jews. We spoke Arabic at home, and our social customs were Arab customs, and we had many Muslim friends, and Muslim-Jewish coexistence for us was not a distant dream. It was the everyday reality, and there was nothing very unusual about this because there are Jewish communities throughout the Arab world, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Egypt, but the Jewish community was the oldest, going back to the Babylonian exile 2.5 millennia ago. It was also the most successful, prosperous, and it was the best of all the Jewish communities in the Arab world. It was the most closely integrated with the local society. So that's why I describe myself as an Arab Jew. I'm proud of my Arab heritage, and I'm equally proud of my Jewish heritage. But in Israel, an Arab Jew is a very controversial term. It is said to be an ontological impossibility. If you are a Jew, you cannot be an Arab, and if you're an Arab, you cannot be a Jew. And I beg to differ. I think you can be both. And as Hadar Cohen wrote so eloquently in the passage you just quoted, Zionism doesn't have room for Arabs within it. It's for Jews only. It's a nationalist movement, and like all forms of nationalism, it's divisive. It divides people from between us and them. So I think that the term Arab Jew is still relevant, although there are very few Jews living in the Arab world today. But for anyone who is interested in the Jewish identity, this is a very important phenomenon of the past.
I think it's interesting how this connects with Ashkenazi identity in Israel, because while very much the early founders of the state envisaged it in an Ashkenazi image, and therefore that ended up creating basically a caste system for various types of Jewishness and to what extent they were seen as representing the cream of the crop of the state. A lot of that Ashkenazi culture was dismissive of the historical culture of Jews in Eastern Europe. There was a very dismissive attitude towards Yiddish, for example. And so something that for me is an interesting possibility that could be explored is inside of Israel today, or even around the world, can there not be sort of understanding between people who appreciate the kinds of cultures that their families were engaged in for generations? You know, people that spoke Yiddish at home, people that spoke Judeo-Arabic at home, people that spoke Ladino, and try and reimagine Jewish identity in land of Israel, Palestine, as one that is not explicitly nationalist, that isn't this kind of Zionist melting pot that tried to create a new Jew, and rather one that looks at Jewish culture and its diversity not as an obstacle, but as something that can be appreciated. And so in terms of being able to reconnect with the places where Jewish families came from, whether it is for people that live in Israel or in Western Europe, there is a possibility for people whose families came from Poland today and who live in America, for example, to be able to go back and see that place. For many British Jews, there has been an effort towards reclaiming citizenship after Brexit. And that's partially connected to pragmatism, but also to some extent, inevitably will realize that more people become reconnected to the histories of their families, whether they be from Poland or Germany or Austria. And so that's not something that is really possible to nearly to the same extent for Jews whose families came from Iraq or Egypt or Yemen today. But just as a final point before we wrap up, would you like to visit Iraq today personally? What would you like to do? Where would you go? And on a broader sense, to what extent do you believe that either the right of return or some sort of compensation or the admittance of rights of Jews from Arab countries should be part of the agenda for lasting peace in the Middle East?
A lot of issues, interesting issues there. I'll start with Zionism. The Zionist movement was a movement by European Jews for European Jews. and the founding fathers were all European Jews, and the leaders of the State of Israel were European Jews and predominantly Russian Jews. And the whole ethos of the society was not Middle Eastern, was distinctly European. And Ashkenazi Jews dominated all the elites, the political elite, the military elite, the cultural elite. And Zionism had never been very interested in the Jews of the East. In fact, they tended to look down on the Jews of the Arab world as being no better than Arabs, as being rather primitive and backward. It's only after the Holocaust that this attitude changed, because the Holocaust removed the main reservoir for Jews for the Jewish state. And that's when the interest began, intense interest in bringing the Jews from the Arab world to Israel. But, and this is an important point, Israel never ever saw itself as part of the Middle East. It always saw itself as an extension of Europe. It never wanted to integrate into the region. And Benjamin Netanyahu epitomized this rather arrogant Ashkenazi attitude towards the environment, again, towards the region. And I feel very strongly that I want to transcend the confines of Jewish nationalism on one side and Arab nationalism on the other side. I hark back to the days of my childhood when the Middle East was a more open space with pluralism, linguistic and cultural and religious pluralism. And it has to be said that it's Zionism that has been a very divisive force in the Middle East and turned everything into bipolar, us and them, Israelis and Arabs, Israelis against Jews, against Muslims. So the basic root of this conflict is nationalism. And the notion of an Arab Jew helps us to try and transcend this very deep polarization in the area.
So just to finish up, I still want to ask, if you were to be able to return to Iraq, even, just to visit, what would be your priority to see, to experience?
I would love to return to Iraq, and my wife and daughter would love to go and visit Iraq. And we made a plan to go last year, but then decided that it'd be too risky because the Iraqi parliament passed a law in 2022 which said any Iraqi who promotes normalization with the Zionist entity, not Israel, but with the Zionist entity, is liable to life imprisonment or a death sentence. And I am not only Israeli, but I served in the IDF, and therefore any Iraqi that I talk to could be at risk, could be accused of promoting normalization. And that's why I cannot go back to Iraq, and that's a great shame. But I can go to other Arab countries, obviously Jordan and Egypt, because they have peace treaties, but I've also been able to visit other Arab countries on my British passport. So my experience as a child of a different Middle East encouraged me to think that a better future is possible for our region.
And we'll leave it at that. I very much hope that you will be able to visit Iraq. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for listening to The Jewish Diasporist, a podcast hosted by Ben Yanowitz, Jordan Yanowitz, and Zach Smerin. Our editor is Jacob Zacharia. A special thanks to Ali Halpert for allowing us to use her song Beautiful People. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, other podcasting platforms, rss.com/diasporist, or on our YouTube channel, co-shared with the Making Mensches and Labor Jorn podcasts. You can follow us on our Instagram at The Jewish Diasporist Pod, or get in touch via our email, which is contact@jewishdiasporist.com.